So we'll start with Terry Golway. He's the author of the new biography, I Never Did Like Politics, How Fiorello LaGuardia Became America's Mayor and Why He Still Matters. It was released just last month by St. Martin's Press. Terry spent more than 30 years as a reporter, a columnist, and an editor at the New York Observer and at Politico. And he's also a former editorial board member of the New York Times. He holds a PhD in history from Rutgers University, so I guess it's fair to call him a doctor and a recovering journalist. But as a historian, he's published major works including Machine Made, Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics, Frank and Al, FDR, Al Smith, and the Unlikely Alliance that created the modern Democratic Party, and also John Devoy and America's Fight for Ireland's Freedom. He's taught history and political science at different colleges, including currently at CUNY's College of Staten Island. Terry's also a longtime friend and a frequent collaborator with us here at the Writers Institute. And Andrew Kirtzman. He's also a recovering journalist, so I think there's a theme we might talk about here. But as a political reporter, he worked for the Daily News. He actually started his own newspaper, which we might hear about when he was 16. He covered national political campaigns for newspapers and television, and he's the recipient of multiple Emmy Awards for his work hosting Kirtzman and Company on WCBS TV and Inside City Hall on New York One News. He wrote for the New York Times, the Washington Post, was a contributing editor at New York Magazine. He's also the author of Betrayal, The Life and Lies of Bernie Madoff. And he's published not one, but two biographies of Rudy Giuliani. The first is called Rudy Giuliani, Emperor of the City, published in 2000. The second volume portrays a very different Giuliani, which we'll talk about tonight, is titled Giuliani, The Rise and Tragic Fall of America's Mayor, which the New Yorker named one of its best books in 2022. He's run his own public affairs communications firm, Kirtzman Strategies, for a number of years, and now he serves as managing director of Actum, a global consulting firm. Please welcome to the stage Terry Golway and Andrew Kirtzman. So, thank you for making the trek to Albany from the big metropolis. Well,
first of all, thank you. First of all, thanks to everybody for showing up, but thanks to Paul and Jennifer and Bill Kennedy at the Writers Institute at SUNY Albany, because I can tell you, as a longtime author, this organization is run better than any organization I've ever dealt with.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry. That's very nice. We didn't even rehearse that.
No, we didn't.
But anyway, these two have made different forays up to Albany as reporters. So I first wondered, is there any PTSD or scar tissues when you come back up to Albany? Terry, I know you have a Mario Cuomo story that you're dying to tell.
Which one? Yes, I've been coming up to Albany since the Mario days, and I think the several Jameson I had has taken off the scar tissue a little bit, so I feel very happy, actually.
But your first encounter with Mario, didn't he lay you out?
My first encounter with Mario, I was a fairly young reporter at the New York Observer, and I had written a couple of things that Mario apparently didn't like. Or so he said in a 2.5-hour session at the Executive Mansion while he was dressed, I remember, in a brown tracksuit. And maybe he had been out playing basketball with Paul before, I don't know. But he made it very clear to me, in no uncertain terms, why I was a schmuck. I think there was an adjective in front of the word schmuck, too. And then at the end of this tirade, I mean, it was a tirade, right? But no buts. He then says, oh, by the way, the tone changes immediately and says, oh, by the way, there's somebody who used to work for me who I think you should meet. His name is Peter Quinn. I said, oh, maybe I should look up Peter Quinn. Peter and I have been best of friends for the last 30 years, so thank you, Governor Cuomo.
Well done. Andrew, you came up. Did you have any odd encounters or run-ins with our former governors up here?
I've worked with a lot of former governors. My more memorable encounters are with the reporters who covered them.
Oh, well, that's fair game. Do you want to
Sure. No,
mention anyone? So anyway, we both decided that it would be great. These two books, two very different eras of New York, different political characters, LaGuardia and Giuliani. But we thought we'd let them each read an excerpt to start, to kind of set the stage and give a little context of the subject of their biography. So, Terry, do you want to go first?
Certainly. I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction. And normally I don't read from my stuff because I can't stand the sound of my own words, but I'll try to get through this. So this is from the introduction. Fiorello Henry LaGuardia was America's mayor long before the term was coined. Screw you, Rudy. His outsized personality, gift for showmanship, superb leadership skills, and unquestioned integrity made him one of the country's most recognizable politicians in the 1930s and early 40s. This is a quote. I suppose the two best-known names throughout the entire world in this generation are Franklin Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia, wrote a friend of both men in 1938. That gives you an idea of how famous LaGuardia was. I mean, that's an exaggeration, the friend, but still. It was a slight exaggeration, but perhaps only slight. Newsreels and photographs distributed around the world showed the short, squat mayor of New York forever in action, squeezing into the sidecar of a police motorcycle as he raced to the scene of a fire, smashing illicit slot machines with an axe, directing civil defense drills, and most famously, reading the comics on his radio show during a newspaper strike. He was a 5'2" bundle of energy who wore out aides much younger than he. Quote, "The mayor's a dynamo," humorist Fred Allen said of LaGuardia. "That's why City Hall has to be kept near the Battery." You see what he did there, right? You see what he did there, yeah. A music lover who enjoyed guest conducting the New York Philharmonic on occasion, LaGuardia once compared the job of running New York to that of an organist. You must keep both hands on the keyboard and both feet on the pedals and never let go, he explained. And he never did.
So, Andrew, let's jump up to the other America's mayor, Rudy Giuliani. Go ahead.
Sure. This also comes from the introduction. This begins several months, or actually, let's see, about 6 months after 9/11. Giuliani is out of office. The circus began moments after the Concorde hit the runway. Rudy Giuliani and his entourage, so large that it filled the entire aircraft, stepped down a small staircase onto the tarmac at London's Heathrow Airport on the evening of February 12, 2002. The most celebrated leader to emerge from the September 11th attacks arrived for 4 days of almost incomprehensible hero worship, including his knighting by Queen Elizabeth. The chairman of British Airways, Rod Eddington, greeted him like a head of state. Camera flashes lit up the scene as he presented the former mayor with a cap and bomber jacket inscribed with Giuliani's name. Quote, "For me, it is particularly significant to have this recognition from our good friends, the government of Great Britain," Giuliani told reporters. The next day, he rode past crowds hanging over barricades and through the majestic wrought iron gates of Buckingham Palace. It was just 4 days since Princess Margaret had passed away, leaving her grief-stricken sister to carry out her duties in her famously stoic manner. Guests were instructed by the palace to wear black out of respect. Giuliani stepped out of his car, dressed in a black morning suit with a silver striped tie, white handkerchief, and an American flag lapel pin. Organ music filled the palace's grand ballroom as guests were presented to the Queen. There were over 100 people receiving honors, among them his former fire commissioner, Tom Van Essen, and police commissioner, Bernie Kerik. But only Giuliani would receive an honorary knighthood. An attendant announced the former mayor's arrival in a booming stentorian voice that would have impressed Cromwell. For services after the September 11th tragedy, the most excellent order of the British Empire, to be an honorary knight commander, Civil Division, the Honorable Rudy Giuliani, lately mayor of New York. The dreamlike quality of the visit continued after the knighting. Giuliani was feted at a banquet led by the Lord Mayor of London and driven to Downing Street for a joint press conference with Prime Minister Tony Blair, who lavished praise on him. That night, he was a star of the show at a rollicking benefit for 9/11 families held at Babylon, Sir Richard Branson's restaurant at the Kensington Roof Gardens in London. The extraordinary thing about this heady experience was just how unextraordinary it was for Giuliani. The knighthood was just another stop on the circuit for a man well on his way towards becoming one of the world's most celebrated figures. 6 weeks earlier, Time named him its Person of the Year, portraying him on its cover with the headline, Tower of Strength. 3 months earlier, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly, an honor usually reserved for heads of state. A week before that, Oprah Winfrey introduced him as America's mayor to 20,000 cheering fans at a Yankee Stadium 9/11 memorial service. Interspersed between the events were pilgrimages from world leaders such as Francis Jacques Chirac, who dubbed him Rudy the Rock. It was not until 2 years later that the National 9/11 Commission sorted out Giuliani's role in the disaster and cataloged a list of catastrophic mistakes by his administration that left hundreds of police and firefighters vulnerable on that awful morning. There was an argument to be made that Giuliani had cost lives on September 11th rather than saved them.
Thank you. So that kind of takes us to the pinnacle of the rise, and we're going to talk about the fall because it's a huge fall. But anyway, I want to start with you because you have this weird connection with Julie on 9/11 when after the towers fell. Can you talk about how you had this bond and how you became part of his 9/11 narrative?
Sure. Well, I was a political reporter at New York One News, which is kind of the CNN for New York City. It was election day, primary day. I was kind of sleeping in because we'd be on late that evening. Phone rings, and it was my mother telling me, turn on the television. Saw the smoking towers, flew out of my apartment, ran into a taxi cab and completely terrorized this cab driver to take me down towards the World Trade Center. And, he was obviously not that thrilled about it, but I had this press pass. And I said, I'm a reporter, take me down, as though this was some magic amulet. And somehow I managed to terrorize him and to taking me down. I emerged after the first tower had fallen. And, the streets were empty and eerily quiet, and there was kind of ash all over the street. It looked like Christmas. And there was a police officer there who started screaming at me. He was like, get off the street, get off the street. And there was, I remember there were these two nurses in, nurses' garb, both wearing face masks. And I asked for a face mask, and one of them gave it to me in an act of, extraordinary charity. And the police officer was absolutely livid. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm a reporter. I'm looking for Rudy Giuliani. He's like, oh, Giuliani's right there. And just by dumb luck, Giuliani was standing there. He had just come out of an office that was collapsing after the fall of Tower 1. And he was covered in ash with Bernie Kerik and Tom Van Essen, his whole crew. And he saw me, and he said, come on, Andrew, let's go. And we were all this kind of ragtag, bunch. There wasn't even a car. I mean, it was complete anarchy that day. And we started this kind of sojourn up Church Street, going north to try to reestablish some semblance of city government. And then Tower 2 fell behind us, and we went running for our lives north. And I guess the trek kind of concluded at a fire station right in Greenwich Village, and the door was locked because all the firefighters, God bless them, were down at the Trade Center. And we were just kind of circled around this fire station looking at a locked door. And a detective pulled out his gun, and everyone was like, don't do that. And somehow, magically, they found some kind of crowbar and like opened up the firehouse door and let us in. And Giuliani went into the small fire chief's office and did a phone interview with New York One, and a sister station of CNN. And that's when he first spoke to the nation.
Wow. So we're going to leave it there, a bit of a cliffhanger, because you have a long history with Rudy, and you wrote that second of your large book. But I'm going to go to Terry. I think the two books kind of connect to each other. So LaGuardia and Giuliani, as we said, America's mayor. But there's already been a Broadway musical, a lot of LaGuardia biographies. How will you find a fresh angle? Why did you want to write this now?
Well, there is some overlap in the sense that they're both Italian-American Republicans, and of course, Giuliani would say, and Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, correct me gently, but Giuliani did want to pattern himself after LaGuardia.
Oh, he was a role model, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, I think he brought in LaGuardia's desk at City Hall. I think that might be true, but that also could be urban legend, right? The thing that we recovering journalists make up. But LaGuardia's integrity and his devotion to public service is genuine. And, we're all reporters here, right? We're as cynical as anybody can be. And when I approached this project, and frankly, Paul, I did the book because my editor said she always wanted to do a book about LaGuardia. And I said, but Elizabeth, I write books about people named O'Connor and Kelly, and in other words, people who are taller than me. So, why would I write about this guy? And she said, because he's appropriate to today. And I think his honesty and more than anything else, his devotion to public service. This was not a man who got into politics to get rich. He's not a man who took advantage of his connections after he left office, although he did die fairly not long after he left office. But he died with $8,000 in war bonds and a mortgaged house in the Riverdale section of the Bronx. That was it, right? For him, you hear politicians say this all the time, and I don't want to break any news to anybody, but sometimes they don't mean it. He meant it. He meant it. He loved serving the public. He also loved being in charge, which is something else that LaGuardia and Giuliani very much had in common, right? LaGuardia was mayor. Giuliani was mayor. And the only comparison I would make also would be to Ed Koch. These were three people who loved being in charge, loved the celebrity that came with being mayor, and just basically liked being in charge. The difference being is that he was 5'2", and there's all sorts of things we can say about that. People did call him the Napoleon of New York, right? Even though Napoleon, it turns out, wasn't as short as me.
Andrew, I want to talk about the very different Rudys between these two books. I mean, your first book, he's at the peak of his power. You've covered him for 8 years during 2 terms. And then you start writing something very critical. The Washington Post, a big piece, 2019, and then he cut you off. He shut you off, it seemed like, since then, for the last 5 years now, except for the occasional, You only heard from him randomly, what you put in the book. Describe that. The only time you ever heard from Rudy since 2019.
Right. Well, just to back up a bit, I had written the first book, Emperor of the City, to talk about his rise. And then, whatever it was, 10 years later, Simon & Schuster asked me to write a book about his rise and fall. And that's what this book is about. And I reached out to Giuliani. We had this kind of interesting back and forth over text message. And he gave me his kind of feelings of persecution and why he'd like to believe the press was fair, but ultimately they persecute you, and the conversation kind of ran its course, and that was that. It was clear he was not going to cooperate with me for this book, and every now and then my phone would ring, and it would say Rudy Giuliani, and I would pick it up, and he was basically butt dialing me, and I would hear him like. There was once he was playing basketball. It was like kind of shouting at his kids. He was, it was kind of symbolic of what had happened to Giuliani. He's kind of how this famously rigorous, disciplined figure had become so undisciplined, so sloppy, and it's something we had seen. We saw on television when he came back into the limelight under Trump. And that was just kind of like my little experiences. Every now and then when he'd call, I'd be like, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Mayor. Couldn't hear.
But also contrast to the way LaGuardia left office and died. I mean, after he was America's mayor, he had this consulting firm. Didn't he tens of millions? Did anyone ever figure out how much he made trading influence? And
right.
How much was it?
Yeah, I mean, some heroes, right? And that's what he was regarded as after 9/11. They go off and they become, they become larger-than-life people and become whatever, university presidents, or they run for office. Giuliani simply decided to cash in. And he founded Giuliani Partners with a whole bunch of his cronies from City Hall. None of them were management consultants. It was this managing consulting company run by people who had never had any experience in that. But that's not really why people hired them, right? They hired them because they were getting the imprimatur of, America's mayor. I mean, OxyContin, pharmaceutical company, Purdue. They hired him not because he was the world's best managing consultant, but because they could associate themselves with his godlike figure. And in answer to your question, Giuliani's firm made $100 million in 5 years. He became stratospherically rich, right? And he became incredibly materialistic, which I can.
And it's all gone now, right? He's apparently broke. Is he really broke?
And now he's broke. And now he's just declared bankruptcy.
You believe he's really broke?
He's selling off some properties, but he's, that was $150 million that he lost in that defamation suit.
So Terry, we'll cut back to LaGuardia. I love the title. I never did like politics, but he's a 3-term mayor. He's a 7-term congressman. Do we take him at his word, or was he just so popular? Okay.
So the title of my book actually comes from a letter that LaGuardia wrote to the Secretary of War during World War II, Henry Stinson. Because by this time, LaGuardia was a 3-term mayor, as Paul said. He also was in Congress for 7 years, and there's stuff in the book that I never knew about LaGuardia as probably one of the most famous congressmen in the 1920s, and the only Italian-American congressman. He was the first and only Italian-American congressman for the longest time. But by 1943, there was all this stuff going on in the war, in the world, in Europe, and being mayor of New York bored him. He's pretty clear about that. So he decides at the age of, I guess, 63 or 64, and perhaps not in the best shape, not that I'm one to speak, but perhaps not in the best shape of anyone out there. No one would ever mistake him for, say, The Rock, or somebody like that. He decides he wants to be a brigadier general. So he's lobbying his best friend in politics, Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat, right? And saying, look, I think, the Allies are clearly going to invade Sicily and then Italy. I think I could be, because he was LaGuardia was a veteran of World War I. He proudly called himself Major. If you worked for Mayor LaGuardia, you didn't call him Mayor, you called him Major, right? So he thought he could still be of service, and it is about service, but it's also where the action is, right? At one point, he writes to Roosevelt and said, I just feel like a janitor now. All I do is pick up the garbage in New York, right? Which, by the way, is a very honorable job, mind you, right? So he's full-time lobbying, and he says to Henry Stinson in a letter, I really would like to be of service to the country. I'd like to get a uniform again because I never did like politics. This is a guy who, as Paul says, he's now in his third term as mayor of New York. And I read the letter and my first response was, nobody asked you to run for mayor, dude. Right? I mean, you've been mayor since 1934. You were a congressman before that. You don't like politics? It's like sort of me saying I don't like Jameson, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? But that was his pose, right? That was his pose. He was not a politician. They all say that. But I think Rudy, I think Fiorello really believed he was not a politician. Politicians were Tammany Hall. Politicians were these other Republicans who were, getting lobbying money and things like that. He was different. And you know what? I think he was right. I think he was different. He also wasn't very popular with his colleagues, as you might imagine,
Andrew, I want to get to Donald Trump. He's the elephant in the room in this book. And you really started about 2000. Rudy announces at a public event in Bryant Park that he's separating from his second wife, Donna Hanover. He's already been, having this affair with Judith Nathan. And the press is on him, the tabloids on him, things are going bad. So Donald Trump sets him up at this secret hideaway in Mar-a-Lago to keep the press off him. He's got a tunnel under a road for him so he doesn't have to meet the paparazzi, and he sort of shelters him for a couple months. And this was where this bromance started, I guess. But talk about that period and how he then became his legal representative and lawyer.
Sure. Well, to back up a bit, one of the pleasures of writing a second book is I got to access the mayoral archives that were not available the first time around. And we actually discovered all of these correspondences between Giuliani and Trump that were really cool. And it turned out that Giuliani was doing favors for Trump, long before the 2016 race. They were simpatico, right, for reasons that I think, it's been widely discussed. They were both kind of outer borough brawlers. They respected. They were both kind of authoritarians. They were on the same wavelength, right? So your chronology is a little off in that he runs for president in 2008, right? And so, at that point, he is at the height of his popularity. There was a poll at the time showing that Americans, he was more popular than the Pope among Americans. I mean, he was a god, and he was looked upon that way, not just in New York, not just in America, but around the world. And so he spends a year at the top of the Republican primary polls, the front runner for a year, joins the campaign in January 2008 and crashes and burns. He was just wrong man for the times. He's like rhapsodizing about 9/11 and terrorism when this is 7 years later when, he's out in the cow pastures of Iowa talking about terrorism, and it didn't really resonate. It didn't feel like, Iowa was under threat. And he mangled the abortion issue. He was just terrible. And so he's in and out of that race in a little over a month. Drops out after the Florida primary, and his 9/11 halo is gone, right? He's a loser. And I did a lot of research for that time period, including several hours, I would say about over 10 hours of interviews with Rudy Giuliani, his ex-wife, who had never spoken to the press before. And she told me these extraordinary stories, and one of them is about kind of the emotional wreck that he was going out of that experience. And, she took him to her parents' house in Palm Beach, where he just kind of decompressed, but he started drinking. He was very, kind of felt sorry for himself, sat around in a bathrobe, smoking cigars, just really kind of a basket case. And the press found them, and she, looks for a place to for some privacy. And who does she call but Donald Trump? And Donald Trump says, come to Mar-a-Lago. And they kind of escaped to Mar-a-Lago. And as you said, they put them in a cabana on the beach across from Mar-a-Lago itself. But there are all these tunnels running under Mar-a-Lago. So they were able to kind of enjoy life without the scrutiny of the press, and just traveled under these tunnels. And he's in terrible shape. He is like drunk all the time. He is like falling. There was one story in my book about how he falls down drunk outside of a movie theater, and he's got this big gash on his head, and he's worried because he's due to be on Saturday Night Live in a matter of weeks. And so, I got the tape, or whatever you call it these days, of that show. And you could see, like, under heavily, pancaked makeup, you could see that scar on his forehead.
Yeah, we'll get back to that. But Terry, so LaGuardia dies in 1947. He's just out of his final term for 1 year. Why do historians consider him one of the best big city mayors in all of America across decades? What was, he came into Depression, he got New York through that, but what were his other big accomplishments?
No corruption. He was a three-term mayor of New York, and basically there wasn't a breath of scandal about his administration, right? And that's really hard to do, right? Ed Koch couldn't pull that off. Mike Bloomberg couldn't pull it off, but LaGuardia did, because he demanded expertise. Right, this is where his anti-politics thing, with the rubber met the road. I'm old enough to remember when Ed Koch took office after winning the 1977 primary and general election against Mario, and he said, there'll be no patronage in my administration, to which we, of course, all roll our eyes and say, yeah, right. And there was in Koch's administration, which we saw in his third term. LaGuardia said there'll be no patronage, and there was none, right? To the despair of New York City Republicans who hadn't had a mayor since Seth Low in 1901, who was a Columbia University professor who wasn't big on patronage either, right? So the Republicans had been dying for patronage. He wasn't giving them any, right? He ran a true nonpartisan administration, and as a result, New York was governed better than it has been ever since, right? Every mayor, Giuliani, Koch, de Blasio, they all say they want to be the next LaGuardia, and they don't measure up to this guy. That's one reason. And the other advantage that LaGuardia had is that he had a best friend in the White House named Franklin Roosevelt, who of course was a Democrat. And Franklin Roosevelt was spending WPA money like it was going out of style. 1 out of every 7 WPA dollars during the Depression was spent in New York City. I think that if Franklin Roosevelt hadn't been president, we may not be sitting here talking about Fiorello LaGuardia, because a lot of what he was able to do, yes, it's great to run a scandal-free administration, that is wonderful, but he built modern New York, right? The largest WPA project at the time was an airport in northern Queens that LaGuardia insisted on building, that is now, of course, LaGuardia Airport. So he and Robert Moses, for better or for worse, built modern New York, and that's certainly something that he's remembered for as well.
You tell the story, how it became LaGuardia. There was no airport there. Right. He was coming back from Chicago. Share that story. So
LaGuardia is coming back from Chicago from a Conference of Mayors conference where he's the chairman, and he's on this flight, and his ticket says Chicago to New York. And as all New York flights did, it landed in Newark. And everybody, because this is what you did, you got off the plane and then you went to get a cab to get your ferry to Manhattan. Except for this little guy in the back who said, I'm not getting off. The pilots come back and say, but Major, whatever your name is, you've got to get off. No, I'm not getting off. My ticket says New York. The director of the airport comes out and says, Mayor, you've got to get off. I'm not getting off. They flew him from Newark to Floyd Bennett Field in Queens, which the airlines even then wouldn't use because it was too far from Manhattan and the runways were not long enough, et cetera, et cetera. Surprisingly, Paul, there were reporters at Floyd Bennett Field to greet Mayor LaGuardia as he got out triumphantly. And, basically, it is at that moment that LaGuardia Airport becomes a thing, right? He goes to Harry Hopkins, the head of the WPA. He goes to Franklin Roosevelt and said, look, New York has prospered by being on the cutting edge of every transportation innovation since the Erie Canal. And we're going to let Newark be the hub of the East, of the airlines in the East? I don't think so. And basically Roosevelt wrote him a blank check, said, yes, you're right, New York should have a major airport. And within 2.5 years, from idea to fruition, LaGuardia Airport was built. And it wasn't named LaGuardia right away. It was called something like, Northern Island Airport. But the Democratic, Tammany-controlled city council, in its graciousness, named the new airport LaGuardia Airfield. And the mayor, who was then presented with this resolution, said, well, I'll think about it. Yeah, he thought about it for about 7 seconds, and it became LaGuardia Airfield, and it became the airport that Andrew Cuomo rebuilt just a few years ago.
That's a great story, but if you could channel your inner Fiorello, since you spent all this time with him, what would he say about Trump? This man of integrity, this man of no scandals, this very efficient mayor. What do you think he would make of Trump?
You're going to bring out my Staten Island vocabulary, which
That's
may not
fine.
be a
This
good
audience
thing.
can handle it, Terry.
I mean, he would be appalled. He would just be appalled. He would ask. He would ask of voters, because he actually was pretty tough on voters. At one point during World War I, during the run-up to World War I, he basically said, "If you don't favor America, just don't vote for me. I don't want your vote." And I think he would look at Trump supporters and say, what's happened here, right? What happened to the idea of service? What happened to the idea of, I mean, he wasn't the most civil guy in the world, but he seems like Cicero now, right? What happened to the idea of this commonality? Because Fiorello LaGuardia, although he was the first Italian-American congressman, he didn't call himself Italian-American. There was no hyphen in, and mind you, I have a proud hyphen in my identity, but back then, LaGuardia thought of himself as an American, and that he shared this tradition, this common civic knowledge. And whether it was a guy on the east side of New York or a woman in Prescott, Arizona, which is where he spent some time, that we had this common civic religion, and we respected one another despite our differences. He would look at America today, and I'm sorry, he would say, was it all worth it?
So, Andrew, I want to get to this elephant in the room that we haven't really addressed directly, Trump, and this is what you write near the end of your book. You said, Giuliani's role was to enable the president, feed him lies, encourage his worst impulses, and lead his most malevolent battles. He did so enthusiastically because Trump had made him relevant again. Then you also conclude, Giuliani, on the other hand, was finished in every conceivable way. Trump is obviously the current Republican nominee for president. Do you feel he's a tragic figure? Was it self-inflicted wounds? Did Trump, sucker him and bring him down? And do you feel, should people feel empathy or sadness for this guy's fall? Big questions, but we're going to go to the audience after this too, as we promised. So,
I think the word relevance is key to the answer here. I mean, I think that what happened to Giuliani, I think, could be summed up in the word desperation. He was desperate for power, and then when he lost power after the 2008 race, he was desperate to regain the relevance that he had lost, and it sent him into the arms of Donald Trump. And he made just an endless series of moral compromises that were the endorsement of Trump being the ultimate moral compromise, right? This moderate Republican, he had pro-abortion, but also someone who was also revered back in his prosecutor days for his integrity, right? Even his morality, endorsing perhaps the least moral man ever to run for United States president in our lifetime, at least. And I think it was just this tragic sellout in order to regain the kind of prominence, to be in the newspaper, to be on television, to be in power. And then when Trump started tottering towards the end, after, during the election, disputed election, and then January 11th, January 6th. Thank you. Giuliani was the last man standing, right? He was the last man telling Trump that you had won the election. And it wasn't just because he wanted to tell Trump what he wanted to, what Trump wanted to hear. He told it to him because he needed Trump to stay in office. And look what's happened to him out of office.
I'm going to go to the audience. Jen has a mic if you raise your hand. But the last question, should Giuliani and Trump be in prison right now for their role in the insurrection? And
I'm sorry, your question is?
Should Giuliani and Trump currently be in a federal prison?
I'd leave it to the audience to decide.
They might want to ask it.
That was well done.
Take a vote.
Sorry. Yeah, he's going to take a mulligan. Yeah. Jen has the mic here.
My question is there anyone living now who can say to, quote, Trump voters what you imagined LaGuardia would have said?
Wow. Unfortunately, I can't think of any, but I would have thought, but this shows you how out of touch I am, which is not exactly breaking news. I would have thought that somebody like Mitt Romney or some sort of establishment Republican would be able to go to or Liz Cheney. Right? Actually, Liz Cheney would actually be a person you would think. Look at her credentials, right? How could you possibly describe Liz Cheney as a rhino, which is what every Republican critic of Trump is described as a rhino. Liz Cheney is no rhino. My goodness, she voted. She did not support the first impeachment of Trump, right? She voted, against impeachment. So I would have thought that Liz Cheney would be somebody that mainstream Republicans would listen to, but there is no mainstream Republicanism anymore. And anyone who does speak out is condemned immediately as a rhino. And frankly, if John F. Kennedy were writing his profiles in Courage today, he certainly would put Liz Cheney on his list, right? But nobody listens to her, right? So I don't think there's a figure like LaGuardia.
I know nothing of this woman sitting next to me. I want to come back to something that you glossed over a little bit in talking about Giuliani. He reached the end of his second term when his star was still riding very high. His successor managed to engineer a way around term limits and take a third term in the wake of the fiscal crisis. Did Giuliani ever consider a third term and decide against it, or did the idea never occur to him?
No, it's a famous story in which Giuliani was celebrated on 9/11, and suddenly, he was walking on water, and so he decided, a week before he was to leave office, that he wanted his term extended, right? Not a third term, but he wanted all the rules of elections thrown out the window, and his term extended, I think it was for 6 months, just because he was Rudy Giuliani. And only Rudy Giuliani could save New York. And, there are a lot of people who were so enthralled by Giuliani at the time that they supported it. And Mark Green, who was the Democratic candidate at the time, was kind of cowed into supporting it himself. And Bloomberg supported it. And that shows you how venerated Giuliani was, despite this absolutely crazy idea. And eventually it was, I believe, Sheldon Silver, the Assembly Speaker, who vetoed it.
And to that point, I was a working reporter back then too. On September 11th, as Andrew said, that was primary night in New York, primary day, right? The night before, Mark Green called Bobby Kennedy Jr. and said, because they were friends, and said, Bobby, you're talking to the next mayor of New York, which on September 11th was probably going to be true, right? Because there was this guy that, frankly, not many of us had heard of, named Mike Bloomberg, who was spending a lot of money, who was probably going to win the Republican primary that day, September 11th, and Mark Green was going to win the Democratic primary. It was pretty much thought, right? And Green would have, I think Andrew knows this better than I do, but I think Green would have been the favorite going into that general election were it not for 9/11. The primary is suspended by about 10 o'clock that day, I guess, or there and about, right? And now the dynamics have completely changed, right? Giuliani endorses Bloomberg, who was the longest of long shots. And by the way, as you may have noticed, Mark Green was not the mayor of New York, right? So 9/11 really changed New York City history. I don't think there's a Mayor Bloomberg without 9/11. I think it would have been Mayor Green.
Absolutely true. And if you remember, it was during the World Series that Bloomberg premiered the television commercial in which Giuliani throws his arm around Bloomberg, endorses him for mayor, gives him the seal of approval, gives Bloomberg the mayoralty.
Right, we'll point out that the Yankees were in the World Series and they lost. You're talking to a Met fan, so I had to point that out.
It's a coda.
Yeah, my question is just on the relationship between LaGuardia and Robert Moses. Who controlled?
It depended on the day, right? So Robert Moses is LaGuardia's parks commissioner, but he's been empowered by Al Smith, right? Al Smith was the guy who plucked Robert Moses out of academia, where nobody knows how to do anything, and I speak as an academic, and made him to be Robert Moses. So LaGuardia inherits him, and they are at each other all the time. Because what's also interesting is that LaGuardia's lifeline is Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt hates Robert Moses, and likewise, right? Robert Moses refers to LaGuardia by all sorts of politically incorrect terms, right? And that contempt is mutual. So LaGuardia has to walk a very fine line. But at a certain point, Robert Moses realizes that LaGuardia is getting into housing. LaGuardia founds the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, right? New York didn't do public housing before LaGuardia. And LaGuardia also is then able to convince the governor of New York, Herbert Lehman, and the President of the United States and Senator Robert Wagner that the federal government should be involved in housing. Moses sees dollars, right? There's money to be made in housing the poor. So he decides, without telling his boss, because he doesn't regard anybody as his boss, Moses decides to give a speech in which he's going to announce that the New York City Housing Authority would now be subsumed to an authority that he, Robert Moses, will be the head of. And he announces it, and he's got his plans, and it's all planned out. He's giving this speech live on WNYC radio, which of course, at the time, was New York City's municipal radio station. Except that somebody told LaGuardia. And LaGuardia brought in the head of WNYC and said, you know those engineers you're sending out to cover Moses' speech? Cut the cord. Moses went on with the speech. The WNYC logo is in front of him, and he's speaking. There's nothing going out over the air. Now, the newspaper reporters, we print people, we were there. Well, Paul might have been there. We're too young, right? So there are news stories afterwards, but basically, LaGuardia had out Moses, right? And did this great power play. And to be honest, and the other thing is, every now and again, Moses would come in and say, Fiorello, because he didn't call any politician except Al Smith. He called Al Smith governor. Every other politician was by his first name. Fiorello, yeah, I'm going to resign today. It got to the point where, finally, at one point, Moses comes in and says, Fiorello, I'm going to quit. He said, oh, really? Oh, well, here's the letter. Just sign it. He didn't quit. So Moses met his match in the Little Flower.
Thanks so much for being here. Could you talk a little bit about LaGuardia's role in civil defense and what that meant for his power and legacy?
Oh, absolutely. So, again, LaGuardia wants to be where the action is, right? So this is before the United States, this is before Pearl Harbor. And throughout the 1930s, LaGuardia is a powerful voice against Hitler, which today seems, well, no kidding, right? But he was on early and often. He sort of did in the United States what Winston Churchill was doing in the UK, saying, we have to pay attention to this. This is a madman. Right? So he's getting involved in global politics in the 1930s. Once war breaks out on September 1st, 1939, when the Germans invade Poland, he realizes, modern warfare means long-range bombers. And we could be subject to the same thing. So he lobbies his friend Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt at a certain point must be like, oh my God, just get him out of here, give him anything. So he creates this job. He creates the job of head of civil defense, along with Eleanor Roosevelt. So they're co-chairs. And LaGuardia spends a fair amount of his time in 1940 and 1941, when he's running for re-election, as the chief of civil defense for the United States. And he's conducting air raids. There are pictures of him with the helmet and the whistle, right? And he's constantly telling New Yorkers, well, I was out in Seattle the other day, and we had the civil defense raid, and they did this, so maybe we should do this. And he took the job very seriously. By the way, that's a full-time job. And so is being mayor of New York, right? Only Fiorello could have pulled this off. But finally, though, and he was constantly clashing with Eleanor. Eleanor's idea of civil defense was persuading people that the United States was a great country and worth fighting for. So she was more on the educational side. There was one particular amount of money that she put aside for dance therapy, which is something no one had ever heard of in 1941. And LaGuardia was asked about that, and she sort of said, yeah, you'll have to ask the First Lady about that, right? And Eleanor writes in her memoirs, I soon realized that my job was to take anything that the mayor of New York didn't want to do, right? So he was in charge of civil defense, but frankly, once Pearl Harbor happens, President Roosevelt, in his wisdom, decides, yeah, maybe we should have a full-time civil defense director. So LaGuardia resigns from that position. But I would argue he was out there saying, Americans, you've got to wake up. What you see over the skies of London is going to happen here. Obviously it didn't, but he was afraid that would happen, and he wanted New York to be prepared for what happened to London. So I think it's an important part of his legacy.
Hi, Andrew. In your estimation, if you can pick the most outrageous thing in Rudy's rise and Rudy's fall, I used to live in New Jersey, so I saw it from across the river for quite a few years. I'll be interested in your take.
Well, I'd probably vote for the marital split that played itself out on television, right? I don't know whether you've all heard this story, but it seems impossible to believe from a rational point of view. But Giuliani, if you start from the beginning of my book, you'll count the number of extramarital affairs that Giuliani had leading up to the famous one, in which he is rumored to be out with this pharmaceutical executive named Judith Nathan, and the press finally gets wind of it, and it's in the middle of his campaign for the United States Senate against Hillary Clinton, right? And so it was, I think, the Daily News that broke the story, and all hell breaks loose, right? And so the press, finds him with her dining at Tony DiNapoli's restaurant in the Upper East Side, and they kind of watch them walk down Second Avenue. And I later found out in the course of writing this book that he was fine with it. He almost planned it, and because that's Rudy Giuliani, he doesn't apologize for anything, and so he very proudly, paraded his extramarital affair before the press. And the the antagonism between his wife at the time, Donna Hanover, the city's first lady, becomes so kind of toxic that he decides to take the initiative, holds a press conference on live television, and he announces that they're divorcing. And the only problem was that he hadn't told her. And so his wife learns on live television that she and the mayor are divorcing. And there are so many over-the-top stories involving Giuliani. I mean, his dressing in drag in front of 1,000 people. Fast forward his antics in the Borat film, where he's literally caught with his pants down. The Four Seasons debacle, the hair dye. I mean, one of the pleasures of writing about Giuliani is that the stories are just so, out there. And, it was one thing when he was this, as I mentioned before, this very kind of successful, powerful, disciplined, strategic mayor doing all these kind of crazy things. It's another fast forward when he's working for Trump and he's making a fool of himself, not just, personally, but also running around Ukraine, right? Trying to prove that Joe Biden was corrupt. And he did it so incompetently that it gets Trump impeached, right? What is it? Just, I don't know, a year later, he's one of the people most responsible for getting Trump impeached a second time. I mean, he holds the world's record for igniting not one impeachment, but two. And that's, when you're an author, like, what could be better?
Andrew,
that's why I've written 2 books about Rudy Giuliani.
Andrew, if I'm not mistaken, that famous press conference where he announced his divorce, wasn't it also outside St. Patrick's Cathedral? I seem to think
so.
That. Yeah.
I think so, yes.
Well, why not?
We got a question here. The gift that keeps on giving, Rudy.
He is.
2 comments and then a question. First comment, I really loved your book about Frank and Al.
Oh, thank you.
Very, very interesting. A suggestion for your next book.
I would like that, yeah. It was about Franklin Roosevelt and Al Smith, for those of you who don't know.
Because I learned a lot of interesting stuff, which I was not aware of, how the relationship between FDR and Al kind of really totally disintegrated. A suggestion for your next book, Bob Moses and FDR.
I think there's a guy called Robert Caro who's covered a lot of that material.
1,200 pages worth.
But that's true. I mean, it is
a shorter version, like you did with
I'll do the Cliff Notes version. Yeah.
Or with LaGuardia. My question is related to, unfortunately, LaGuardia passed away in 1947, not that long after he had left politics per se. What do you think he would have done if he had lived?
He wasn't done, that's for sure, right? After he was mayor, President Truman asked him to head UNRWA, which was the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, not the United Nations that we know today, but as some old Altacacas like myself know, the Allies during World War II often referred to themselves as the United Nations. So he was the head of the United Nations organization that was unconnected to the international organization, and he went to Europe and basically did what Herbert Hoover did after World War I. He fed and housed the refugees from World War II, including his sister, who had married a Jewish guy in Hungary who was sent to a concentration camp. She survived, but she was a refugee during World War II. So he was doing that. He was doing God's work after World War II. At one point, he's being criticized because American aid is going to countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Poland, which are clearly going into the Soviet sphere. And he says, well, communists need to eat as well. That didn't go over well, right? But that gives you an idea of how candid he was. So he clearly was plotting something. Maybe, I mean, Tom Dewey Dewey is governor by that point. So I'm not sure if the governor's position would have been open. I think, if memory serves, and it often doesn't, there was a Senate seat open in 1948 that, Robert Wagner resigned from the Senate in 47 or 48. LaGuardia probably would have run for the Senate, I think.
We've got time for one more audience question.
Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation. My question is also about the Second World War and LaGuardia. I was wondering, did he make any attempt to lobby for European Jews during the war with Franklin Roosevelt, given the composition of the city, etc.?
I'm not sure that he ever lobbied Franklin Roosevelt, but if you read his speeches, if you read what what Fiorello LaGuardia wrote about Hitler and what was going to happen to Europe's Jews, he was saying it from 1933, to the point where the United States State Department apologized to the Nazi government for what Fiorello LaGuardia said about Hitler in 1937. So Rabbi Stephen Wise said that during the 1930s there was one American telling the truth about Adolf Hitler, and that man was Fiorello LaGuardia.
Wow. I would remind you that, applause for that. A reminder that Bookhouse is here. These are two fantastic... I was going to say drop the mic, but not yet, Terry. Anyway, two fantastic political biographies from seasoned political journalists. So get a book from Bookhouse, and we'll sign up along that wall right after this. They'll bring out a table right over here. But my last question, since you're both attuned to New York City politics, right on the stage 5 months ago, we had Melissa DeRosa, who, her book, she wants to engineer the Cuomo comeback. Now, Eric Adams seems wounded. There's whispers that Andrew's going to jump in that race. Does Andrew have a chance to become the next mayor of New York?
Yeah, I think he does. I think he does. For one thing, I think that there's a disenchantment with Eric Adams just on the level of competence. And, Cuomo, also New York is having, a very tough time, right? There's just a feeling in New York that no one's in charge. And, Andrew Cuomo, say what you will, this authoritarian, I don't want to use the word Giuliani-esque, but, this...
Go ahead and use it. We thought
it. Like very, famous for his ruthless tactics, but also for his accomplishments, of which there were many, including LaGuardia Airport. I think in that frame, I think a lot would be forgiven.
Terry?
Well, I have lived in Maplewood, New Jersey since 1992. I can tell you the ins and outs of the coming mayoral election in Maplewood, New Jersey. But New York City politics, I gave up on that 20 years ago.
So, what a great night. What a wonderful political stories. Let's hear it for Terry Golway and Andrew Kirtzman. And come on up and say hello and get your book signed. Thank you all.